And I'm Joe Murphy. I'm the director of the Center for Innovative Pedagogy. I'm the guy who, greetings YouTube viewers, I'm the guy who forgot to hit the record button. And I was trained as a librarian before I got into the Center for Teaching and Learning business. And I will, so back to Charlotte and Orchid for the session on Help I Failed a Student.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. I want to sort of like just give you a little bit of motivation, a little bit of a reason why I was motivated to put this, to reach out to Charlotte, to put on this sort of, this workshop. And it began last fall, actually. And like John and other people, I noticed the shift to disengagement from students. And I'm a very new teacher. I arrived at Kenyon College in fall 2019. I had some experience of teaching in New Zealand, but not, I obviously taught when I was in graduate school, but I'm not as sort of like proficient or have extensive experience as some of my colleagues. And so I've never sort of had to be in a situation where I actually had to fail a student. I, like a lot of my colleagues, I think there was the pandemic has sort of heightened our collective understanding of the external and internal challenges that students face right now. And so typically, I sort of eased up on sort of like my rigor, really. Well, not rigor, but I wanted to give students a lot of leeway. I wanted to sort of meet them on their own terms. And holistically, I typically grade holistically. I have always tried to sort of see how students are encountering the material and to sort of look at student improvement, skill acquisition, alongside the course learning outcomes. And I never grade for late work. I never grade for attendance, only sort of like community participation, which can mean, quite frankly, many different things. So I try to create very different modes of expression that students can sort of reach their learning outcomes. And yet, for the first time in fall 2019, fall 2021, I really struggled with in my first year seminar, where I actually had 5 students who were completely disengaged and or were turning in work sporadically, or just for some reason were unable to do the things that that I felt that they needed to do in order to reach the learning outcomes. And all the students, bar one, actually ended up, they did end up passing. But for the student that literally I had no evidence in order to give them this sort of grade, and I actually honestly felt I had an existential crisis. I didn't know how to deal with this, and I felt that I had failed the student, that somehow I had not been able to reach them or motivate them, or I'm not sure. I was just trying to grapple with many different things to sort of understand why it is that I couldn't bring the student over to the finishing line. And so thinking at the time, it's like, okay, I need to look at the evidence, what the student had presented, and grade accordingly. And as a result, the student had failed. And it was really horrible experience, to the point where I actually posted on Facebook, and I'll show you the post that I submitted on Facebook. I said, I've never had to do this before, but I'm going to have to fail a student, and it sucks. I want to reach out to them to articulate that I believe in their success, but what do I say? What would help? Any advice? And as a result, the great thing about Kenyon faculty, and I'm so grateful to my colleagues here, is that they do reach out and they sort of give great advice. I had a total of 69 comments, and that included commiserations and advice. As I attended to the various comments, I realized that I was struggling with the definitions of what failure and success actually looks like in the classroom. I didn't really know how to communicate the expectations, and at what point was where my responsibility was and where the student responsibility was. What does agency look like in this process of failing and succeeding, and whether these are even right terms. We've actually, Charlotte and I have written out some questions, a lot of questions that sort of popped up, and we'll post them in a bit. But it was a colleague who would have been with us today, Krista Dalton, made a really stellar comment that has sort of really percolated. I continue to percolate, and she said, well, we need to support the students, but we also need to protect their agency to sometimes make bad decisions. If they have chosen to disengage, there is a choice there. But at the same, so this is so I really like that idea. How do we preserve the agency of students? That maybe sometimes an F is good, but at the time, there is a lot of complexity in this question, because sometimes students, do fail because of external pressures that are beyond their control. And so, how do we sort of complicate this idea of the grade system that demands a kind of like, you're an A, you're a B, you're a C, and you're a D, and elides the sort of the complexities of student and also faculty lives and supporting staff lives. So those are the kinds of things that sort of popped up for me. And before I sort of throw over to Charlotte, who also has their own experience in this, I'm going to recognize that this workshop will also be a failure. In the sense that, these are, when we're dealing with student disengagement, these are complex issues for which there are really, I don't think, there are plural responses, and not all of them are going to fit to each particular student. So my hope is that we can curate a conversation about the strategies that we've done and the strategies that we didn't do but wish we did, as we sort of look towards the future, because the pandemic is still very much with us, and we will be dealing with the residual effects, I think, for many years to come. In my own case, I'll just sort of before I pass to Charlotte, is that I ended up emailing the student in question, and I gave them the full explanations as to why I couldn't pass them in the course, and then opened up the door for them to actually reach out to me to have a further conversation and to offer them support, what other resources that they could use to help maintain their engagement or find success, including student reaching out to student accessibility accommodations support as well. And unfortunately, they didn't take that up with me, but that door never closes. So on that note, I'll throw over to Charlotte.
Absolutely. Thank you, Orchid. And I am just so glad that you did post on Facebook about that, because it really was in that moment where I was going through a very similar experience. Also, that was my first semester at Kenyon. So just finishing up early round of things, and knowing that I was not alone was really, really helpful. And in this case, I was inspired for this workshop by a student who I ended up failing, who really made me sad, because I had really thought that this student would be able to excel in the class. I mean, it was an art class and I had seen her work and it was good. But if only she turned in the assignments and came to class, right? And so I learned, and maybe this is a little naive, but I learned that my belief in their ability to succeed was stronger than their current ability to participate in what I was requiring. And that doesn't mean like forever, but at least at this time where they were enrolled in my class and I was giving them feedback, right? And so, of course, I've been asking myself, what could I have done to have prevented it? Which I think every educator asks themselves. And it's interesting hearing from you, Orchid, because you did reach out to the student. I kept wishing that I could have talked to the student again, to tell them that I didn't judge them for it. But I realized that there was not much I could do in that case, because in this case, the student felt that they had already failed early on, and they had expressed that to me, that their standard for what was success or failure, they had already failed in their mind, despite me saying, hey, like, you have not failed. That's what this class is for. You won't fail if you do X, Y, and Z, right? but I realized that their own preconceived sense of failure existed outside of my class and existed in society in terms of how they saw themselves as a person. And also, I was thinking a lot about perfectionism and how this student was like, oh, I missed like 2 classes, so I've already failed, or I didn't turn in my 1 assignment on time, so I've already failed. In which case, to me, those were very small concerns in the grand scheme of things, especially if they continue to keep up communication. So this has gotten me to asking myself, what is success? And that is really complicated in art because being a good artist does not necessarily mean being a good student. So how do I deal with that? I also have been thinking about these ideas of different types of failure. So in this case, the student, just what, for lack of a better term, kind of ghosted me. They ghosted me, they ghosted the dean. What can you do at that point? So sometime, essentially, I talked to the dean at that, and he said, sometimes a student must fail. You have to give them an F. I mean, if they don't show up for the last 2 weeks of class, nor do their final, like, it is what it is. And I realized that I was holding my students and their grades to my own perfectionist values. And that, for me, I didn't want to fail any of my students because I'm a perfectionist and I don't want that like on me, right? But, and it may seem obvious, but I think I have to pay less attention to my own desire to see the students succeed and more attention to their needs in that moment. For example, with this case of this student, we give a lot of checkpoints at Kenyon to say, hey, you can like back out of this class, like this is your deadline if you want to drop, there's a lot of checkpoints to make sure that the students don't fail. So, how could I have been more aware of those in the first place? And if I had been less in my own head about, I think you can do it, and more like maybe a little bit more empathetic about where that student was emotionally, I might have given them the advice to withdraw from my class sooner, thinking that, not expecting them to be able to succeed like I was. I also just have to realize that sometimes I might not always know the right answer, and that sometimes you only can know after the fact. So a lot of other questions that I've been asking myself in terms of the pandemic are, how much should I be chasing after my students when they are absent or missing assignments? I spent a lot of time doing this over the most recent academic year, which I've never done before. Is this safety net actually helping or hurting my students? By supporting them, am I not actually challenging them enough? Is that my job to avoid as much failure for them as possible, or is it coddling? That's something we also talk a lot about at Kenyon, I think. And then just to kind of tie it into what happened this semester, I had a very different example of a failure with a student, which was a plagiarism situation. And so I realized that that is a very different type of failure than, a student not doing the work, right? So this is like, I share this as my current, this is currently going through academic infractions. And so I'm reading literature about plagiarism, but a lot of it is about written work rather than visual art. So it's very complicated because to me, this seems very cut and dry. In terms of a plagiarism case, a student turned in photographs that were made by another student, not by them. I found them on a public social media account attributed to a different person. But, and then I start to wonder, why would the student do this? And I realized, does anybody know why? Why would the student do this? Maybe I ask you guys. I mean, maybe I've been thinking about it a while, but go ahead.
Panic. I
have
this thing, and again, remember, students take 4 courses every semester. They have work in all those courses that becomes due. They're not great at time management. So they don't think if something's due, like they know from the first day of class, they're going to have 2 essays due on the same day. They don't think, oh, maybe I should start one earlier. They both start at the same time. And so that leads to requests for extensions, but it also leads to a kind of panic, which is I've got to get something in. And I think that's probably the big,
what, not wanting to what, Lori?
well, wanting to be able to get something in.
Not wanting
Even
to
if it's-
fail.
Yeah, not wanting to fail. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Right? Because that's what I realized, because I was just like, I looked at this student's transcript and they need to pass. And if that's the shortcut, right? Sometimes in terms of plagiarizing is that shortcut so that you don't fail, right? But it's kind of a fatal flaw.
I think they've also grown up in a culture of sampling where they have a harder time seeing those distinctions than, say, in my generation, which, dinosaurs roamed the earth. But I do think they're kind of used to lots of works that tend to sample without really citing. And so they don't entirely understand. So I was kind of amazed this year how little my students understood citation.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I, am left in wondering, like, to me, this was a case of very cut and dry. Like, I can show you the images next to each other. They're the same, it's not like in an essay where you're maybe borrowing a little bit here and a little bit there, right? And there's a little bit of fear of, will this be considered plagiarism if it's run through Turnitin or whatever? But in this case, it just seems straightforward. So, but, then I'm having to support, by reporting this plagiarism, I am, what am I upholding? I'm upholding these sort of academic systems that also uphold perfectionism and white supremacy. So to wrap up, what I want to say is that, we are asking about this freedom and failure, and not everyone has the same privilege to fail, and there are different repercussions, i.e. not all failure is equal. Some people might lose their scholarships or immigration status, familial support, or campus privileges such as leadership positions in sports. So when we're thinking towards queering failure, looking towards the rest of this workshop, how are we defining success in a way that privileges white, cis, hetero, able people? And I'll kind of stop there.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Charlotte. As you were talking, you were sort of touching on some of the questions that we were sort of thinking, and so I've just put them into the chat. Can there be a freedom and failure? You're right. Freedom. If there's a freedom and failure, that failure is going to affect certain people unevenly. And so how do we sort of like mitigate that? How does failure affect different people unevenly? How do we define success and failure inside and outside of the academy? What do you do when students don't ask for help or pursue other avenues of help? And they sort of also tie into your question that you actually have to sort of, at what point does chasing after the students become unhelpful? And detract or reduce their agency in their education. And I just, before we sort of like move on, I just want to sort of like, in response to my experiences of failing the student, I decided to completely not grade students at all this semester. And so I went to a completely ungrading model, where students, I did give students rubrics and showed them sort of various avenues of like how they can sort of like achieve success. It's not a perfect system. I'm still working it out. But as a result, every single student handed in every single pieces of all their work, all their assignments, and everyone passed. So I think that works sort of like for some disciplines. I don't know whether I don't know how ungrading would work in something like biology or chemistry. So I know it has been done, but it's not always a perfect system. And also ungrading also still requires me to input a grade. So again, it's it's a kind of a band-aid to the sort of like I think the broader issues. So I don't know whether there are other questions. The other questions that we sort of also looked at or wanted to sort of, and we're just sort of, we had so many questions because this workshop is of course a failure. It's like we're just generating more questions. But some of the things that I was still thinking was like, how do we empower them to be actors in their own educational development? The whole point of me moving to an ungrading system was to sort of like, I'm going to make students understand that they do actually have agency, that I'm not just some person standing up as some kind of like authority. I'm not, I don't consider myself authority at all. I'm still learning. But I do want them to sort of feel like that they can take charge of their education, which is really hard, I think, in a system where students might not have that. They might not have experienced that, especially for first years if they come from a certain educational background. And at what point is, and this is the hard one for me, is at what point is, failing the student the right option? And some of the comments, I can't remember, someone had spoken to me that they had failed a student, and that student came and approached them 10 years later and said it was the best thing that ever happened to them. And so it was like, wow, there is sort of like, is there a value in sort of like the value in the F? And so these were just some of the questions that were percolating for me, as sort of like grappling as to what it means to fail a student. So I think at this point we're sort of thinking, and we encourage you to sort of like maybe sort of think about your own experiences with failure, and maybe some, and then we can sort of like, I'm kind of curious if we could just sort of crowdsource some commonalities that we can address in the wider group. Charlotte, did you want to do that in the Slido? Just this thing that just fascinates me.
Yeah, I think we can. Let me share so that people can join it again if they need to. 1 second. Oh, I see some questions.
Oh, great.
Failure happening.
So there is a great question. What about faculty failure? What are the outcomes of investing time in students who are risking failure, especially for students who might be resisting first efforts to help? I mean, these are really both great questions, and I'm sort of also really conscious that when we're sort of, and this goes back to I think what Charlotte was saying, is to sort of like chasing after student. What about sort of faculty? How do we sort of accommodate faculty labor, and what are the outcomes of time? Outcomes of investing time with students who are risking failure. This has been something that I've been grappling with as well. I think also because we're very conscious, at least I am, that faculty burnout is very high, and I was very burnt out at the end of the spring semester. I still am burnt out, but and it is sort of it is a challenge when also investing time. I did worry when I was investing too much time in the student who was resisting help, that perhaps I was also removing access to myself to other students who were actually doing okay, but probably needed more support. And so I wasn't quite sure how to sort of manage that. So, and the third question is, how can we communicate to students that there are different kinds of failure with different consequences in a way that sounds fair? And so maybe we should have this kind of conversation in relationship to this idea of queering failure.
I'd be happy to talk about my experiences.
Yeah,
because I think I could probably hit it. And I being the oldest person in the room, and with 40 years of teaching behind me, these are things I've thought about a lot. And one of the things, like Orchid, when you said that you let your students turn in papers whenever, I did that too. And then this year, what I began to realize was how much extra work that was dumping on me. And part of my burnout is all the extra work I've had to do in order to let students have that slack, which they then take more of, until I was at the point where I would have students in my class basically asking me to pass them for doing nothing. Like, that's what I want to do. I just want to do nothing. And so I think we have to also think about ourselves and what we can sustain. And I can't sustain the pace that I was doing I was working 7 days a week, every week, all semester, all year long. And a lot of that was down to late work. And, you know, in past years, I would have 1 or 2 students that were doing that. And in this semester, I had one class where more than half of the class was doing it. And then all of a sudden you finish a batch of papers and then you realize, oh no, I've got half of the class yet to do and they haven't come in yet. And they'll probably come in about the time I start on the next one. So I think we have to think about our labor, yes. And the second thing I'll say is that I failed 2 students in the spring. I had 4 seniors who would have failed the class, but I didn't have the heart to keep them from graduating. So one withdrew for health issues. 3 of them, I said, if you can turn in a final. So what I was doing completion grading, and I had scaffolded a longer project. So the idea was, and I kept telling them over and over again, you get to do all this stuff early on so you can get all your failure out of the way early. You can make every mistake in these really low stake assignments that take maybe 10, 15 minutes to a half an hour to do. And then you will also build up this writing that will serve as your final project. And again, more than half of the class simply did not turn them in. And so with the seniors, I basically said, if you can turn in anything that resembles a half passable paper at the end, I'll give you a C-. And so there were 3 seniors I gave C-minuses to just to get them off, get them graduated. And then there were 2 undergraduates who I failed because one had 0 points in 100 out of 100 and had been gone since spring break. I had not seen her and she had not responded to she had ghosted me. She had ghosted the deans. Then I had another student who for the entire semester turned in a 3-page paper. And none of the scaffolding assignments that went to build it up. So at that point, it's like, well, what do you do? There's just absolutely no way in good conscience, whatever the problem is, because I had talked to every one of these students. It's not like except for the one who ghosted me. It's not like I hadn't been talking to them, and it's not like they hadn't been saying over and over again, oh yes, I'll get this in. Oh yes, I'll get this in. Oh, I'll have it all done by this weekend, over and over again. So, I mean, maybe that failure is important for them. Maybe that's a way of them kind of coming to terms with their own perfectionism. Maybe failure is the way you learn how to deal with it. And so having that, you know, I don't know. That's my story. And I think I'm going to be more rigorous about deadlines next semester. Next semester is my last semester. And I am teaching a course on revising sentences, in which all we're going to do in the course is revise sentences. I'm so excited about that. I think it'll be very restful. But I'm going to be a lot more rigorous about making them make deadlines and starting with really low stakes things. I think the best way to get students to understand failure is to get them to do it with low stakes assignments. So I know Judy Smith, who used to teach in the English department at Kenyon, would never accept a late paper. It was absolutely like she just upfront, I will not accept anything that's late. And she began with really low stakes assignments, failing students, so that they got the message that my work comes first. And so, because I think some of this comes from how students prioritize work. They figure out who's not going to cut them slack, and that's the first thing they do. And if your paper is due on the same day as their paper, they're going to come to you and say, can I get an extension? And the further away they get from that deadline, the less likely they are to actually do the thing. So I think maybe one way to do it is to be a little more tough on deadlines, but begin with really low stakes things so that they doesn't immediately put them in the position of failing the course.
Yeah, that's interesting, Lori, because something that I have been trying to do in my syllabus and just in my pedagogy in general is being really clear about what is higher stakes and what is lower stakes, because you know, and part of that I've had to figure out a little bit, but making sure to make that very clear to them, like, okay, you know, you have a discussion question every week over the course of the semester. It's an all or nothing. You either do it or you don't. I'm not grading for your grammar, but you know, making sure to make it really clear so there's nothing hidden in that way about how to pass the class and what I am defining as success or as failure for me. So, and I was thinking so that we could kind of utilize the Slido maybe a little better than we have so far. So, you know, reiterating in the current, while you're seeing it happen, I would love to see, you know, from everybody, how you define failure or success, because I think it'd be interesting to think about like how you define it just coming into this workshop. And you can submit multiple answers also. So, you know, these are low stakes answers.
Can I say it verbally? Because
absolutely, I love that.
Typing on the computers, I don't know, I can't speak as fluently. In the fall semester, I had 3 students who risked failure. One got a D, one got a D minus, one got an F. And so I think the way I defined success was for the student who got the D, you know, I have some papers, but really exams are one of the bigger contributors. But the student kept working with me, kept coming to office hours, kept trying, stayed engaged, came to class, answered questions. And so, you know, really her exam grades, she earned an F in terms of her exam grades, but in terms of her class engagement and growth over the semester, you know, she did okay. Then I had 2 students who were definitely risking failing. One of them, I said that, you know, towards the end of the semester, listen, at this point, you have missed this assignment, you've missed this assignment, you need to make up. I said this to 2 different students. One of them did it, got most of the stuff into me in a timely manner so that there was something to grade, and the other student didn't. And that, to me, again, I look for engagement and how are you engaged in your own learning. I try to message to my student, I'm not giving you a grade, you're earning a grade. And then that takes it from me being the person that's dictating your grade to your own engagement dictating your grade.
Yeah, I tend to define success in my class in terms of, have you learned something? Have you shown improvement? So again, the last 2 years I've been doing completion grading. And so the students simply get points for completing things. And I think that evens the stake between students who may be coming from a really good high school where they've really learned lots of stuff, as opposed to students who may have had less good educational experiences, to try to even that out. So what I do when a student's going from one thing to the next, what I say is that if you get better, that's what I'm looking for. That's success. If you're going from your rough draft to your final version, and the final version shows that you've learned something from your rough draft and my feedback, that's success. So the only failure in my class is you didn't do it. That's the only form of failure. I have never failed a student for anything other than not completing the work. And unlike, I think the problem in the sciences is very different, because there is knowledge that students have to master to move on to the next step. We don't have that problem quite as much. There's some of that, but it's not as you know, like I want my doctor to really know his anatomy or her anatomy. Whether or not somebody knows their gender studies or their grammar is less important than the grand scheme of things. So for me, the only failure is simply not doing it.
Yeah, I totally I agree. I'm very similar. Like I like to sort of see growth, and I always have students do reflection papers where they actually literally name and explicate, this is what I learned at the end of the semester. It's like, this is what I learned. This is how I might also transfer this knowledge elsewhere. I had a student in my spring semester that I realized that due to their disability, that the kinds of assignments that I had set wasn't going to work with them. But they and so we created an alternative. They were at risk, I think, if I didn't sort of adapt the course, they would have failed. But by adapting the course, they, you know, and they came to every class, they came to office hours as well. They communicated, they demonstrated verbally their learning, and so I was able to sort of, you know, that was for me a success in the sense that, you know, that I was able to sort of accommodate or find a different model of expression for the students, whether they could articulate their learning in a way that best suited their sort of their abilities and their strengths. And I guess one of the things that I would sort of like be much more mindful of going into teaching next time around is actually to be sort of like to have more possibilities for assignments at the back of my head, so I can make these kinds of quick turns. I just want to also say, Laurie, I didn't encourage students just to hand in their assignments anytime. Like I did actually have deadlines. I did because it was precisely for that reason, is that I don't want them submitting in the last on May the 13th.
Yeah. I had students who were going to assign. We're going to turn in like 10 assignments all in the last week of class. I'm like, no, it doesn't work that way. No, I didn't think you did that, but I did learn this year more than I ever have in previous semesters, that allowing those late papers, especially when they get, as I like to say, when they start to smell, when they get too old, is creating a lot of extra work. And if a lot of students are doing it, then it's a real problem. And when you only have a weekend to get through a batch of assignments and half of the students don't turn it in, then you're already behind and you just get further and further behind. So, yeah.
Patricia, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I haven't been typing anything because I've been listening to everyone's responses, and I am struggling with trying to preserve that flexibility in my classes so that students who are having emergencies like can turn things in late, but also recognizing that I think the students are keen enough where they know which instructors are going to allow them to turn things in late, and to create and to like how to balance like that flexibility while also having a really firm deadline or a very firm system of deduction so that they actually are facing penalties for not doing the work. And I think that actually might help some of them just sit down and do it, because they get into, I think they get into this mental space where they're like, okay, yes, I didn't turn in this assignment, but I met with the professor in office hours, I got an extension, but now they know they can get an extension. And they start to think like, if I blow past that deadline, I'll get another extension, which is what I did this last semester. Like I kept giving them like chance after chance after chance until you're in the last week and just, you know, begging for them to turn something in. So it's something I'm trying to debate whether I make kind of an oral announcement in class at the beginning of class to say, I'm willing to grant extensions, but you only get like so many extensions per semester or grace days, or trying to figure out how to be really equitable about flexibility as well, because I think there are certain kinds of students who are really good at asking for help, expecting help, and then asking for the extension, versus certain kinds of students who either feel like they don't even know what to ask for, or they're not even aware that we have these unspoken extension policies. And so they'll either just, you know, not turn it in because they'll think, well, I already missed the deadline, so why bother turning it in? Or they will turn it in late, and then I give them the deduction for being late, versus someone who then doesn't turn something in for weeks. And because I'm so grateful at the end that they turned something in, I then give that student full credit. Is this something that you guys also kind of, struggle with as well, where then it seems really messed up that there are students taking late deductions throughout the semester because they just needed one extra day, and then someone who got like 3 weeks is getting full credit just because I don't want to fail them?
I've really been taken with a token approach to this. And like I've heard these referred to as oops tokens. I've heard people finding different language for it. But the idea is to tell students as part of the, when the semester begins, here are, and I've heard of people doing this physically. Here are your 3 OOPS tokens, or whatever is appropriate for your ability. And I think Laurie's point about your ability to manage late work is extremely important. But also, the amount of work in your course and, what can you use? You can configure all of this, but it's the idea to say, I'm just going to say 3 times during the semester, something can come up and you can blow a deadline. Here's a free week. It's 1 week, 1 token, get it in. And now, again, the student has agency, and the student also kind of has a budget. And, hopefully they kind of come to understand, well, if I blow all my OOPS tokens, I have left myself no ability to get the Kenyon crud in late November. So I should maybe bank 1 or 2 of those and actually turn something in. I'm taken with this approach, and I've heard of people who've had good success with it.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just also sort of say, and actually it was you, Joe, that I saw you posted on Twitter, and it was a retweet for someone you knew. So I don't know who the original person, but it was about, if students want to ask for an extension, they have to sort of also explain why they want an extension. I tried that in the spring, and it actually kind of worked. Students would have to say, I would like an extension of 3 days so I can research this extra word.
And I think the one that you're talking about, again, this is also getting you out of the negotiation business. I think the one you're referring to, and I wish I could remember the person who did it, and I can't cite them either. But they made a Google form, and it is just name, assignment, reason it's going to be late, date I can have it to you. And again, this way the student has established, I'm really sick, I need a week, or I need to do more research, and it can happen over whatever. And there's always the flexibility to say, no, you may not have a month on a homework assignment. But yes, the idea is to make the student set as many of those parameters and justifications as possible. And then the other thing is you have a nice little spreadsheet that says, okay, Joe's essay is coming in Friday, or then we go to the late policy.
Can I just throw 2 things in here? And now I've just forgotten them. One is that never assume that because something works in one class, it's going to work again. I had so much success with completion grading and scaffolding in last year when I was entirely remote. And this year, everything just went kablooey, like nothing worked. And I couldn't get students to turn things in any way I could think of. So you have to kind of bear in mind too that something may work really well in one class in 1 year, and then the next year it doesn't work. So it's not always, there's nothing foolproof in teaching, I guess. And I can't remember what the other point I wanted to make was, but if it comes back to me, I'll raise my hand.
No, great. John.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up. I had the exact same experience with my inorganic class, that the online part 1 seemed to go pretty well, but the in-class, where I do a lot of pre-class stuff that's just graded for completion and stuff like that, wasn't as smooth. So I'd have to second that assessment there too, that what works once may not work again. But
Yana.
I wanted to take us in a slightly different direction also in terms of different types of failure and whether it benefits. I think some of growth for some students, particularly if they're having mental health struggles in the classroom, particularly if they're not seeking help. Sometimes people are having mental health struggles and they're just staying in their dorm rooms and spiraling, as opposed to seeking the help and doing the work to try to get themselves out. And that sometimes, I mean, you get worried. I don't want to give an F and now this student is like all the way, like without hope. But there's that incentivizing not seeking the help. And this is something that sometimes there's some students who family obligation, something else is going on. But there's students who, you know, are struggling, and I struggle with this. I don't want to be the tipping point, but are they seeking out the resources to help themselves get out of this? Because the goal of mental health, being mentally healthy, or having a mental health day, isn't to not do anything. It's supposed to help you get back to a working point. So
I think that's a really great point, and especially since we know that student mental health is so poor right now. And that's been something that I've really grappled with. I have quite a few advisees who struggle with their mental health, and they don't, you know, they are aware, because I've made sure that they are aware of the kinds of resources that are available, but there is something, you know, that will prevent them from actually seeking help, and that so that they can do, you know, achieve, you know, growth and success, and you know, feel joy at the fact that they're here in college and learning stuff. And it is, I don't know how to, I mean, you can't force them. But what, you know, I am curious about what prevents them from doing it. And I know from my own experience when I was an undergraduate student, a lot of it is shame. At least, you know, in my, you know, from what I can see, is that shame, embarrassment, the feeling that, you know, you're invincible and that you can do things on your own. And unfortunately, you know, we are a community, and, you know, community is part of like the learning process. We're not all individuals doing everything by ourselves. We do need community help, but I'm not entirely too sure how to communicate that.
I just had a question, because we have at Kenyon all these other systems in place to try to catch students, right? Like we file the progress report. And as an instructor, and I don't have any advisees yet because it's my first year, you know, I click submit on the progress report and it goes out into the ether. Do you guys know, like, what happens next? So the students get a copy, their advisor gets a copy, and one of the deans gets a copy, and then between the three of them, they decide what's going to happen next.
So basically everyone gets a copy. It includes student accessibility services. You know, if I get a progress report, I get a copy. You know, the professor gets a copy. Student gets a copy, unless they're told not to sort of submit. I think Kenyon Cox Health Counselling Centre are also copied in. I'd have to check the emails as to who gets CC'd. And you're right that there needs to be more transparency in the system, because I then reach out to a student, and in my case, if I get a progress report, I reach out to my student. I you know, set up a time to chat with them. I also talk to the dean, Dean Hart Ruthenbeck, as well as Dean Thomas Hawkes, to sort of work out what's going on. But it also, you know, I'm not entirely too sure how that talking gets translated into meaningful action. Mm-hmm. And so I think you're right, Patricia, in terms of like, well, what are the concrete steps? I think that needs to be sort of like more effectively communicated.
Yeah, I just looked, I think they BCC those. So you can't see who all got it.
Yeah. And that is sort of like, you know, I do sort of think, you know, one of the things that you might be sort of, at least how I'm interpreting what you've said, Patricia, is like, what is this sort of like the chain? You know, if these are sort of like, these progress reports are meant to sort of support and help facilitate student access to services so that they can help, what is that sort of chain of transparency that we can sort of see so that we are all communicating the same thing? I'm not sure. Go ahead, Laurie.
I'm trying to remember. I was reading a book earlier this semester called Pedagogy of the Depressed. That's what it was called. And I was struck by that because it begins saying nobody's ever titled something Pedagogy of the Depressed. And I think I had an article in like 1988 called Pedagogy of the Depressed. But anyway, one of the things that he argues is that progress reports are often overwhelming for students. And that this idea that we're constantly tracking students through these kind of bureaucratic systems may be a problem as well. I can't remember because it was back months ago that I read this, but I was kind of struck by this kind of pushback against the sort of bureaucracy of the progress report. But I don't know. It would be interesting to find out from students how they view progress reports, because I don't really have a clear sense of how they respond to them. And my guess is it's probably very different, but in any case, it was kind of an interesting read.
Well, I sort of ask because I had kind of 3 different types of responses to my 3 students from this semester who failed or were going to fail. And I had one student where Dean Hawks was emailing back and forth with me about their situation. Another one where Dean Hawks seemed to be not actively involved, but then that student's advisor was directly emailing with me. And then a third student where like I had, other than me sending in progress reports, I didn't hear back from anybody. And so it seems like there's a very varied set of responses institutionally to how various advisors and deans choose to handle the situation based on how they perceive the student's situation, or whoever maybe has a better, closer relationship to a student. And I'm just curious if other folks, like what your experience has been with communicating with your failed students, like other support network. If at all.
Well, I think it'd be interesting to hear. I mean, I don't want this to be too focused on Kenyon, so I'd be interested in hearing other participants, like how, if that's kind of how it's dealt with at your institution, or if does it seem similar? Any of you who want to jump in, Ayana, Jessica, or Peggy?
We don't have regular progress reports. We do. It used to be called Blue Whistle. I don't know what it's called now. Care reports, maybe. It's changed over the years. So that if you are worried about a student for many reasons, not just academic, but it's like Patricia said, it's like it goes out into the ether, and then you don't know what happens next. But we don't have these like regular progress reports. We put in midterm grades so they know their grade, but we don't have this reporting kind of structure.
At Otterbein, we have something called Cardinal Concerns, and it's a form that anybody can fill out for a student if there's any type of concern. And there again, and it gets filtered to different people on campus, but you really don't know what happens once you fill that out. One of the main questions that we've been dealing with recently is having this balance and understanding about mental health stress because of what's happening in people's lives versus mental health just because you're a college student, and where do you balance and how do you address these different stress factors when you really don't know where they're at.
We have a similar system, I think, to what Ayana and Peggy are describing, where anybody can submit a concern about a student for a variety of reasons. And I will say that I have gotten some follow-up questions and some updates, not necessarily on every one that I've submitted, but I do have confidence that they are going somewhere and being addressed, and I always appreciate that follow-up when I do get it.
Thank you so much for sharing about that. So if one of the things that we sent to you before meeting was an article from the Failure Pedagogies book, which Orchid and I were looking at. And one of the essays we included was the uses of queer failure. And it's really striking to me how this idea of kind of flagging the students has a lot to do with mental health. And thank you for linking the reading, Orchid. On page 130, and I don't know if you necessarily have to read along, but it always helps. The authors say, let's try a new direction for queer failure that doesn't necessarily play nice with normative pedagogy. And then it says, to this end, pedagogy traditionally defined produces the pedagogical mandate of happiness. This pedagogical mandate of happiness makes queer failure always already a bad feeling. Someone has to be a failure for someone else to be a success. And if success always produces happiness, then failure demands one not to be happy. And so I was kind of intrigued by this linking of success and happiness, like as being so binary to this idea of failure. And yeah, I don't know, Orchid, do you want to jump in there about kind of how we were discussing queer failure more specifically?
Yeah, I think we were sort of like, when I was sort of, I mean, so this is, I've just put it in the chat, a link to this book, and this sort of came out early last year, no, this year. It's a really sort of fascinating collection of various essays on sort of failure, and it includes things like plagiarism, and chapter 9 sort of like took my interest in terms of sort of thinking about, you know, how do we I suppose reorient or reimagine what failure is, that gets away from these kinds of binary sort of like you either succeed or you'll fail, because I think that also, at least in my experience, it sort of drives the students' ideas of perfectionism, and it's like they either get an A or they failed. You know, there is sort of like there's no nuance, and I kind of feel like, as someone who is working in the humanities, my job is all about the nuances, you know, the messiness, and finding the sort of like the spaces in which success or different kinds of improvement or growth can actually happen. And so when sort of thinking, you know, we don't need to sort of get into, I think, into the sort of like the exactness of this essay, but I was kind of interested in this idea about, you know, what does it mean to sort of reorient ourselves to different kinds of failure in a way that it can be generative and productive. And I'll throw to John.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt or anything. But when you just something clicked in my head when you said binary of success and failure being the only two options. I have in my, especially my lab courses, have designed the lab reports to be, you know, just graded on completion rather than getting the right numbers or whatever, particularly since doing chemistry and stuff like that. And I ask them to, you know, I tell them that getting a wrong number can be more important to you than getting the right thing going on, and understanding that is more important than getting a, you know, straight right answer. And I try to keep that narrative going throughout the whole course of the class to remind them that, you know, failure is actually a success, and sometimes. So it just popped in my mind that when you said the binary nature of that, so just thought I'd share.
No, thank you so much. Laurie.
Yeah, I'm constantly telling my students that the only way you learn is to fail. That if you're always told you're doing everything right, you have absolutely no incentive to change what you're doing. And learning is about changing what you're doing. So you need to fail. Who is the mathematician guy who writes all the stuff? Is it Harry Berger or Edward Berger? He's a mathematician.
Ed Berger, he was the president. He was a mathematician. He was the president of Northwestern or of Southwestern in Texas for a while.
Yeah, he would build points into his classes for failure. He had failure points. And the idea was fail big. And I think that's right. I think that we've built an academic institution that's predicated always on being perfect. And I totally understand why our students are so focused on that perfectionism, because they've been taught it all the way through high school, and they carry it over here. And they're told you're not going to get into a medical school if you don't have a 4.0 average. You're not going to do this if you don't have. And of course, once they graduate, nobody cares what their grades were. Even that's the irony. But we need to rebuild the system so that it emphasizes failure. So that not failure in not doing things, but failure in actually doing things and failing at them. I've also gotten really used to that because I do Duolingo. And one of the things I often do when I'm doing Duolingo is purposely make a mistake so that the rule becomes more embedded in my brain. So I'll be like, I don't know if I should use a duh or a duh here, but I'm going to put one in. I'm going to put what I think's the wrong one in to see how the right one works. And so I do think, and I tell students about this in their writing all the time, is that if nobody tells you your writing is not good, you have no reason to change it. So if I stick an A on every paper and say, yay, la, 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 you have no reason to change anything. But if I am hard on you and I say, you could do it better this way, then you have a reason to change.
I think Joe, and then.
Well, I was going to say that I think one of our mathematicians at Kenyon has a very liberal rewrite policy on works and even on tests. But one of the requirements is explain your failure. I don't just want to see that you can give me a wrong proof and then give me a right proof. I want you to actually say, this is the step where I did the wrong thing. And the wrong thing was some complicated math thing I can't explain. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe I made an arithmetic error and everything cascaded out from there. But I think that's an interesting way, kind of both of dealing with the flexibility of flunking a test is not the end of the world, but flunking a test is not just retesting, like me and Duolingo, is not actually a particularly productive learning strategy.
I was going to say something, but then Joe said that about the exam, and that distracted me a little bit. I also have people, when I do exam corrections, they have to tell me what's wrong, and I've had to teach them how to do that, because sometimes they would say, oh, I chose letter B instead of letter C. Like, you've missed the complete point of me asking you what's wrong. So I have to be more explicit. But one thing I was going to say, when Charlotte put in embracing the messiness of failure, is failure also building, teaching, helping students to gain resilience and resiliency, and being able to bounce back, because everything in life will not have a cushion. Life is nuts and messy. And when Lori was talking about how the system now is so set up so that grades are so important, but the other thing that's happened is, since grades are so important, students are kind of getting an elevated sense of their own readiness in certain areas throughout, as far as I can tell, particularly high school, because the high school needs the grades to be at a certain level because they want their students to be able to get to a certain place. And so the students have just been, so they've a lot of safety nets under them to get to that point. And so then they come to my introductory biology class and I'm asking them to do something harder. And they're like, well, wait, my school gave me an A. What's wrong with you? So that's fine, but building in that resilience, maybe you didn't do so well in the first exam because you're readjusting to college, but that failure, that exam failure, not course failure, but exam failure, to help build in, but even the course failure, to help build in resilience, build up.
John, go ahead. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you for reminding me. Lovely Zoom meetings. But to bring in that idea of resilience, as you were mentioning, I tend to do a lot of metacognitive reflections at the end of each assignment and stuff like that. I don't know, and I haven't gotten any comments back. The students think it's too repetitive or anything, but I generally ask them, what do they feel like their largest struggle was? What do they feel like their, largest success was? And ask them a question, how do you feel your learning has changed from before you started today's class and stuff like that, and having them redictate to themselves what's going on. And I've seen that has actually helped a lot of students, just taking the moment to reflect rather than just, getting a right number or something like that, to help build that resilience and realize it's okay to be wrong at times and roll with the punches kind of situation.
Absolutely. I mean, all of this is making me go back to this idea of, kind of how we were thinking about the definition of failure and success, and the way that grades define failure in academia is that it is a weakness, or like if you get an F, that it's a weakness. And sometimes failing is a good thing, right? But we have to be careful with that idea, because not, like I said at the beginning, not everyone's failure has the same outcome of their punishment. But I think that it is really interesting that we're all here kind of talking about how, like, we could go through examples of how failing actually is the way to learn. Like, you learn from your mistakes. So I wonder how we can define that failure differently in our syllabi or for our students in our pedagogy, in a way that also, I guess still questioning how much of that is a safety net.
Well, I just want to sort of jump on this word that Ayana used was resilience, and resilience is such a sort of, it's an interesting term, and part of me sort of I don't think it's the same as grit. But I think, in some respects we're looking at sort of how do students sort of overcome their various challenges, and one of those challenges might be sort of failing an exam or failing a course. But the question of resilience is also goes back to one of the questions that we had raised, which was how do we build that resilience in the students so that they can bounce back, or how can students sort of be receptive to their failure, so that they can incorporate the learning mechanisms, so that they can approach that challenge in a different course in a different way. And for me, it was I tried to sort of reach to the student that I failed last semester, in the fall semester, sorry, giving them the various options to come and communicate with me, so that I could sort of be transparent, and encouraging them to sort of not see it as the end of the world, because and Laurie, you're right, that who cares about grades once you've graduated? They don't really, they mean a little bit if you want to go to graduate school, but there's always ways that you can frame a bad grade. It's not, there's sort of unlearning, and so I'm kind of, I don't know, but Joe, did you have your hand up or something? See you.
I think that was a vague wave.
Okay.
One of the things that this is reminding me of is that there have been a couple of cases in my time at Kenyon, which is not as long as Laurie's, but I think longer than every other Kenyon's person's possibly put together. But I'm aware of a couple of cases where problems manifested in the senior year because of kind of gentleman's D's in earlier parts of the semester. And there's a level on which it is kind of unfair to a student to say, we gave you 3 years of education and you cannot complete your comps, your senior exercise at this point, and no one ever told you. We allowed you to think that you're doing passing work. Ideally, we'd like those intro level grades to correlate better to the ability to do senior level work. So I think there's a level on which students also need to be told, if you wish to continue in this discipline, here are some areas in which you need to improve. And And you need to take that seriously, not because it's not the difference between a C and an A, it's the difference between an F and an A. And I think that's, or the difference between an F and a C, I guess is what I meant there. But I think that's that's an interesting problem that I know multiple groups have had to deal with when that kind of, and it's not just the highly hierarchical majors, it's, any major where we say, oh, these students never got that skill, which turns out to be critical. Honestly, this was the best thing about my library science education. I had 2 faculty members who said, you have to take written comps. I therefore must give you written finals, even though you will never take a written final again. Turns out I actually do a lot of writing to deadline, but they were right that it's never been on an essay question. But they were honest about this is a graduation requirement and we have to prepare you for it. So I think that's it's another way in which the F is a realistic assessment of what the rest of your college career can look like.
Well, if they get the F, they can actually retake the class, right? So giving them the F actually gives them a second chance versus giving them a D, and then they're stuck with that in their GPA. So it's actually kinder to just fail them and let them retake it, isn't it?
Can I?
Is that true?
F stays in, I'm sorry, but I think the F stays in their GPA too, though.
Okay.
My memory of what I have been told is that when you retake a class at Kenyon, the grades are averaged. Many people would argue that it would be much more fair for the grade to be replaced. I would be one of those people, but my understanding of the policy is that they're not.
Okay. And wouldn't that only matter if it was a class they had to take for their major, right? I mean, otherwise there would probably be little incentive to retake a class that you failed.
Yeah, I don't think most students retake classes that they fail. They can, but I think only if it's a required course.
At Denison, what I usually try to get them to do is drop at midterm and then try again the next semester. Not get all the way to the, because sometimes thinking holistically about the student, if they're doing poorly in my class, they might be struggling in other classes. So maybe dropping my class can help them pay attention to another class. So yeah.
Kenyon has a rule that you can only drop one course in your 4 years.
Wow. Really?
They can drop for mental health or for health issues.
Yeah.
So there is another way to do it, but to get a withdraw incomplete, a WI, they can only do it once. It's called a mulligan rule.
But you could drop as many courses.
I mean, within the drop bad time, not.
Drop ad,
yeah, I was talking about within the drop bad time.
Ours is often too short for them really to know in most courses how well they're doing. But
so I think this is a good moment for me to send out a question that kind of shifts us into thinking about some takeaways, because we are asking a lot of questions. But what pedagogical solutions have you implemented or will implement to support student success based on your experience with failure? So you can, however you want to do it, whether it's answering in the Slido or just raising your hand or typing in the chat, really any way that you want to communicate this. But we would love to know some sort of ideas or anything that you would share with other people. And maybe you've already said some of these things, but if maybe you type those things in there again, we can have a list of them to look forward to.
Yeah, and maybe we'll just give people for some 5 minutes just to sort of have a think. And
Perfect.
And you don't need, if you don't want to sort of write it, you can just sort of write it somewhere else off screen. And we can, when we come back, we can have a crowdsource some ideas.
Yeah, one of us can kind of write down any of the questions that you don't want to type. So I'll put a timer on for 5 minutes.
All right, maybe we should have a look and sort of see what's turned up.
Okay, I'll go down to the bottom.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just remembered that you all can see me when I scroll down my screen. And that's not fun when it's not your own eyes. Okay. So yeah, we were I'm kind of seeing some trends, and yeah, feel free to keep adding things. The poll is open. So I was thinking we could kind of go through what people said and see if we can put these into a few different categories.
I mean, it seems that, some of these, like, there's some of that could be sort of like placed in terms of like front loading, or, the kinds of language that you communicate at the start of the course. And maybe need to be reiterated throughout the course because, obviously the challenges is that students don't often read the syllabus on their own without guided interaction. Oh, sorry, we just lost. Oh, syllabus. Yeah. Yeah. So some of them are like, I will add more to my syllabus and to my introductory lectures and a course about the positives that can come out from failing assignment, or establishing the number of freebies or grace days that allow for flexibility that also protects my own time and sets firm those are, I don't know, those are sort of things that that can be front loaded. Being clear in the expectations of the syllabus and what is the higher and lower stakes. And there was another one as well, being transparent in with course expectations. That there are different methods for success, and maybe sort of finding ways to communicate that. This was my one, so I know. But a colleague in email to give me a handout of sort of like, showing students different pathways to sort of achieving success. Yeah, and at the same time, as someone mentioned, the syllabus is never the answer. We can't rely on it to do the work, to do the soul work, because people will communicate it differently.
Yeah, and I know I kind of responded to that specific answer too, because I was kind of thinking about the syllabus right when the person submitted it. But I was thinking about this idea of the hidden syllabus, and avoiding the hidden syllabus, i.e. being clear on what I will be grading. And then also like this idea, I was also tying it into this one about a library of default language, or, kind of having some sort of, making sure that nothing is kind of hidden, or like, you're getting somewhere new and you have all these like keywords that the student doesn't actually understand. So how do we share this as not just in the syllabus, because students won't read it, but also reminded throughout the semester, verbal, visual, written, different ways.
I'm kind of curious about this sort of like the requests for a library of default language for communicating some of these hard things to students. And I kind of want to know a little bit more about that.
Sure. So that was a suggestion that it would be a useful thing for the CIP to solicit. And it was from a colleague who said, I seem to spend an inordinate amount of my own effort trying to figure out how to trying to craft bespoke language for things that are surely not happening for the first time at Kenyon, or even in a situation like this. And I think the comment about that potentially being alienating is very important. And there's an enormous risk that if I got 3 emails that said, Joe, the conference would have been better. I am writing to you because I have deep concerns. That would not probably be motivating. So it's an interesting risk, but I do think there are some opportunities both for, I think it's worth thinking about when that would be setting a norm, when it would be ensuring that we're saying something about the way that we try to have student-teacher relationships here at Kenyon, and to get people past some of that blank page, how do I say this problem.
So mine were probably the most cynical responses, which is, so after 40 years of teaching, what I've learned is all communication is miscommunication. The postman never arrives. We have to accept the fact that some students are going to fail, no matter what you do, no matter what you say, no matter how clear or transparent you are. And also they will misunderstand what you said, no matter how clear you are and how, and it's because it's actually true that all communication is miscommunications. I never cease to wonder at how students can twist my words in ways that I wouldn't even imagine they could be twisted. And sometimes it's in trivial ways and sometimes it's in less trivial ways, but we ask the syllabus to do too much. I just looked up on the OED what the definition of the word syllabus is, and it's a statement of the subjects covered by a course. And that's what it started out as. It started out as, this is what we're going to do. And then it started out as, this is what we're going to do every class, you know, but now it's meant to bear every single thing. And so we think if we put it in the syllabus that somehow it's done, and it's not, because the syllabus has become so overweighted. I don't think I've had a syllabus less than 12 pages in years, and that's just too much. And so we need to kind of separate out the syllabus, the actual working document that we're going to go through our course with, from all of this other stuff that maybe needs to be somewhere else, and it maybe needs to be handled in multiple different ways. But I just don't see anything, unless we accept those two things, we're probably not going to arrive at good solutions. We have to begin by acknowledging that students will fail and the syllabus can't do all the work.
Ayana.
Yeah, I want to echo what Laurie said. I agree. And I think sometimes we're worried about being equitable in our classes, particularly if we have underrepresented students or first generation students, and we really want to shore them up. So I think there's a difference between trying to make your class more equitable, where, you know, multiple identities have more of a chance of success, and trying to make your class bulletproof. I don't think these are the same thing. And so I think we tie them together a lot, but but faculty, to me, energies, there's only so much, and my predilection is to head towards the equitable as opposed to making it so no one fails, but heading towards how can I make it so that someone's not failing disproportionately based on identity.
I think that's I think that's a really great point, and it sort of gets to sort of like, I think, a question that Charlotte raised earlier is that failure can sort of hit people unevenly. It's the outcomes of it will sort of affect, will certainly be detrimental to some people, and other people will be able to say, I failed the class, isn't that funny? And so and I was sort of thinking about how to sort of like, I guess, catch the safety, catch those students, so that they can succeed and thrive in ways that will enhance their learning and their joy, their happiness while at college. And I think that there is that sort of that struggle that we don't want to have. We don't want to fail students. At the same time, some students will fail, but at the same time, how do we ensure that, you know, our environments are just and equitable and inclusive, so that students can choose and pursue their the work that they want to do without feeling that they're going to be penalized. I'm really sort of like taken with this first one, like design a class structure that allows recovery from failure. And that's a great comment, because it's like, oh yeah, maybe, you know, maybe having sort of like having so many high stake assignments at the end of a semester might be setting up certain students up for failure in a way that isn't going to enhance them. So I really appreciate this top comment, because it does sort of, you know, the things, what can we control? You know, we can't control if a student wants to disengage to some extent, but we can control our class structures. That's an area that we can do to sort of enhance, to create a much more equitable space, so that's, you know, that we can minimize the impacts of failure if they do come about.
We have, this is Peggy. We have one professor that has taken his courses and he has grid them out as to try to gauge where time is happening in his courses and when things are needed. And then he does that with all of his courses, and then he can compare those grids and he can get a sense of where his time is going, where the time is going for the students as far as course expectations. And he has changed his courses and design as far as when some assignments are due and when readings are due and things like that, to try to balance out as much as he can within the term of the course. And he has found that that's been very helpful, especially when he does it with his students in his class, and that they can also see how the course has been designed and where their time needs to be focused as well.
I also wonder, in thinking about our earlier conversation of this false binary of equating success with happiness, is actually to tell students when a particular assignment or reading is going to be really, really difficult and challenging, where it's like, you're not going to have a good time reading this very theoretical work. It is going to be challenging. You will want to cry and you're not going to be happy, but actually successfully doing this part of the class actually means like struggling with it and like sitting in the struggle, and that it's okay that this isn't coming easily to you, and that if it's coming really easily to you, maybe you're in the wrong class. Maybe you need to be at a higher tiered class, and that you should be challenged. And I wonder how much of just setting expectations can kind of help with managing a student's own sense of whether they're doing well or not. Because I think students here sometimes could feel really isolated, where they have no idea if they're the only one struggling in a class or if this was difficult for everybody.
Oh, sorry.
Please go ahead, Orchid.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I really like this idea of normalizing the struggle, because I think, at least here at Kenyon, I think students are risk aversive, and that, you know, part of the learning process is that, you know, I mean, education should not be a hazing event, but there should be intellectual stimulation and challenges that sometimes you don't get the material sometimes, and that's okay. And let's knowing that and articulating that, and then being able to slow down the class so we can actually, you know, grapple with the difficulty, I think is a really valuable life skill, because, you know, we grapple with in life way beyond once college finishes. And so and that might also sort of come back to sort of this idea of sort of how do we organize our class structures so that students can sort of grapple and struggle at various points in the semester, but that they have some sense of experience of improvement by the end of the semester. Perhaps that's one of the goals. Sorry, Joe, go ahead.
Sure. No, I'm glad you said that, because one of the things that strikes me is that I hear reports that there are parts of Kenyan student culture that are very pro-stress Like there is a competitive angle about, how little sleep can I get? How many meals can I skip? How late can I stay in the library to prove how hard I'm working? And I think, Patricia, you make a really interesting point that it would be worth our time to say, but you're not doing the work, right? Like this is the hard one. This is the one that you should expect, because I think that coexists with a lot of risk aversion and pain avoidance. And well, clearly I don't belong in this major if I don't get the theory the first time out, because what I should do is read all the things. Like, actually what you should do is read the thing I gave you because it's important deeply and well. I think there's a really interesting challenge there because so many of our students are in this environment where they're putting forth just a lot of effort, but maybe they're not stretching themselves in the way that we wish they would stretch themselves.
Yes, because along with that goes what I like to call sprezzatura at Kenyon, which is the idea that I can just effortlessly put this out on the day before it's due. I don't actually have to struggle and work at it. And that when I first came to Kenyon, I was absolutely blindsided by that attitude, because of course they weren't turning in these brilliant essays that they just tossed off at the last minute, but there was this sort of sense that a really brilliant student can do that. And if you can't do that, you're not really brilliant. So they're interesting kind of contradictions in the student culture about that. So the idea is that, like, I remember the first few years at the end of the semester, I would hear students saying things like, I have 10 papers due this week. And and then they dash them all off and they're like, oh, this, and no, they were not brilliant.
It would be nice to, send some of the messages like, this one is probably going to be a read it Tuesday so you can reread it Wednesday, like the anti-cramming, but yes, you need to, this is when you need to sit with. You need to let this percolate for a while. Might be interesting.
John.
Yeah. I just was thinking about, and Joe, when you mentioned this competitive nature with wanting to stay up late, there is actually a lot. This is kind of specific more to sciences in graduate school, where there is actually shaming if people aren't in the lab 60 or 80 hours a week. And that's definitely a culture that I hope that is not persisting here with that kind of competitiveness, because that's kind of what's driving it in that particular field. So I don't know, hopefully it's not, because I could see that being very detrimental.
I saw that all the time at my previous institution, which had an architecture school. And I suppose, chemistry and physics labs are dangerous places to be sleep deprived. But injury at that school, injuries were frequent because these are people who you're asking to do sleep deprived work with X-Acto knives. And, and in some ways, I don't know if at the time they got kind of the level of safety training that you would give someone if they were working with dangerous chemicals and electrical currents and such.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is making me just think about going back to the ideas of perfectionism, that it's okay to not be perfect. Maybe that's something we have to remind ourselves even more. I just have a hunch that a lot of us here, if we've made it thus far in academia, have a level of perfectionism that we probably need to unlearn ourselves. And I wonder, that's something I definitely learned in graduate school, was kind of that almost like, right, again, it's the stakes, like what is high stakes, what is low stakes. And also, like, as an artist, it was so hard for me to do an assignment sometimes, because I was like, this is me, like, I don't want to show my soul. But I was like, sometimes you just have to do it. And I think at a place like Kenyon, where everything has this like hyper importance, and I think maybe in college in general, like students are self-involved and all these kind of things, you have to just be like, you just got to turn it in. You just have to get it done. Like, sometimes it's going to be a masterpiece and sometimes it's not. And that's okay. That is absolutely okay. And that's normal. And that's why you have like 10 papers due this week. They're not all supposed to be good. And that kind of, we're starting to run a little bit out of time. And so I wanted to go to one question that someone had submitted on the Q&A in the Slido, which I thought was kind of a good question to end on. I'm hoping we can kind of make this into a positive, not to give the answer before I ask the question, but is the student's failure also my failure? I can open that up to anybody if anybody wants to give an answer to that.
No. I think we can't. I mean, we want to take that on and we want to say, oh, I could have done this or I could have done that. Students are going to fail. And I have had classes in which no student failed, but by and large, they will fail. And or they'll not get the A they wanted, or not get the B they wanted. And that's not, I mean, I always do try to think. I got some really good advice early in my career from a writing center person who said, when you make an assignment, you get what you ask for. And so when I don't get good results in assignments, I always go back and say, how could I have done this better? What did they misunderstand in what I was asking them to do? So I do that, but it's also partially them too. And so I don't think it helps us to take on their failure as our failure. I just think that's not healthy. We can't make a class bulletproof. I think that was a good way of putting it. We can try to be equitable and we should strive to be equitable, but we can't make it bulletproof.
I agree. And I think as a junior faculty, you've got to let go of those failures being your failures. Just like for them, you can grow out of it. If a student fails, then I think about why, or, even to me, get a D or D minus. Why? Is there something that I could do differently in the explanation or in the structure or whatever? I do reflect, but I don't bog down now. Early on I did, but I've had to learn, because you have enough mental stress as a junior faculty member trying not to fail yourself, right? and to keep pushing forward, to take on the students. They have autonomy. They are their own adult, learning to be adult people, and we can help, but we can't. It's like saying, is my failure my child? Is my child's failure my failure, right? I mean, you just can't own all that, or you'll just spiral.
Yeah, we can't be helicopter teachers.
Well, something just about this idea about the class can't be perfect, to bring it back to queer failures. In part of the text, they're actually defining what queer is. What is queer? And one of these ideas of queer is that it's this utopian idea that's always on the horizon and always trying to get better, but knowing that there will always be some level of failure in every iteration.
Many years ago, there was a series, I think it was on the Fox Sports Network, that was called You Can't Blame. And it was looking at moments in sports that have become iconic failures. And none of them are learned from this failures. All of them are, yeah, that was terrible failures. And the point of the series was actually all of those occurred in the context of long games, and there's split-second moments in the context of long games and entire series or seasons. And I think a student who failed to accomplish 40% of the work of the class acceptably, and that's a lot of individual moments. So I think that's another argument for you can't own that, because it did happen. Hopefully you don't have too many courses with individual assignments that are worth 40% of the grade. I might suggest that would be a failure intolerant design. But I think we have to respect that there were lots and lots of opportunities when a student can't reach that bar. You gave them many opportunities to get over.
Yeah, absolutely. you know, I really appreciate everyone sort of coming together to actually discuss my existential crisis that I had in fall 2021, which involved, involved the student. It sounded like it was a very common experience, and it's actually really good to, from me as a junior faculty, to actually hear the similar struggles that colleagues here and far sort of also struggle, because it makes me feel less alone, and that I'm I'm not a failure. And I think it's, we all want, students to succeed, and sometimes we just can't save them all. But what kind of steps? This has been really useful to sort of hear other people's experiences. To what steps can I put in place to ensure it as equitable as possible classroom for my students? So I want to really sort of thank everyone for sharing your experiences. We are sort of bringing this to a close. I want to thank Charlotte for your expert maneuvering. And also to Joe, and also to everyone here for taking the time to join us today. It's been really useful. I'm going to keep you'll be able to access the resources for forever, at least until Google remains in existence. And I did actually fail to sort of accurately, correctly photocopy at least a couple of the chapters. So there's a little bit of black lines, or a little bit of black, that sort of masks some of the text, but I hope that you can forgive me, because there is a joy in that kind of failing to use the photocopier in the English department appropriately. But thank you, everyone. Joe, did you have any last minute comments?
I wanted to say thank you, and please join me in thanking Orchid and Charlotte for this wonderful session. It was a really terrific conversation. If anyone is realizing that they said anything that they don't want on YouTube, again, please contact me and let me know that. If not, we'll edit this together and put it up. The only other thing that I'm going to say is I'm going to go over to the next Zoom call and sing for a while. So if you want to join us for karaoke, you certainly can. If you're in Gambier and you want to come by Edward's house, there are snacks and delightful beverages. I suppose if you want to haul up here, you'd be welcome, but I don't know if we're going to be here for more than an hour, so I wouldn't recommend it. But thank you all so very much, and I hope to see you again as we continue tomorrow and Friday.